What we're speaking about today, as Annette had already said, are wildlife and domesticated animals. And these tend to be some of the more unruly things when it comes to growing produce. So we'll cover why controlling for them as much as you can is important, and then also go through some mitigation strategies as far as what you can actually do on your farm to try and reduce risk associated with growing those crops. So we're going to identify potential routes of contamination from wildlife, domesticated animals, as well as land use in general. Describe practices to mitigate risk associated with wildlife domesticating. Oh, that was double. Describe co-management strategies that address conservation and food safety goals. Describe the importance of conducting a pre-plant and pre-harvest assessment of your fields as far as land use as well as animal intrusion goes. More importantly, if something does happen, what are the things that you need to do to correct for them? So we call those corrective actions. It's typically the term that's associated with that. That you could use if you find something like an animal intrusion into your field, you see a lot of animal activity, what should you be doing to respond to that? And then, of course, there's always record keeping that goes along with any of these food safety systems so that we can really try and make sure that we can demonstrate not only if someone came to audit you or if an inspector came to inspect your operation, they can see what you're doing that one day, but they want to know what you're doing every other day that you're out there in the field. So being able to show those records is one of the big key steps to making that happen.
So managing food safety can be very complex, and this graphic does a great job of showing things that you need to think about when you're choosing a farm or when you're deciding where to put things on your farm. So what do we see going on in this picture? Some things are within our control and some things are outside of our control, right? And we're going to focus on a lot of the things that we can control, but then as much as possible, reduce the risk of things that we don't have a whole lot of control over. So first of all, if we start on this left-hand side, you see this confined animal feeding operation there at the top of the hill. And what happens after those animals go to the bathroom and then we have a nice rainstorm, all of that potential contamination from the E. coli can come right down into our vegetable field because it's downhill from that CAFO operation. Then we have their manure storage right there. It can run off both into the field and also into our water source if we're using that creek or river as our water source. Then we have some wildlife also that's going to come in. That's the one we don't have a lot of control over, but you can see here they have a little hedgerow buffer to reduce the wildlife from going into the field. And then we have things like the wires going right on that end of the field. So the birds are right there on the wire. And of course the birds are going to make deposits from that wire as well. Then we have our free-range cattle on the other hill, and we have runoff into that water source. So lots of things to think about. And if you're just getting started, just looking for a farm, these are some of the things you want to look at. What are my neighbors doing? Do they have a big cattle operation? How is that in relation to the field where I'm going to put my vegetables? So just things to think about. And if you have your own operation, we visited farms in East Tennessee where they had their cattle operation right outside their packing house door because they thought, okay, this is a good place to get rid of our culls. But there's issues with having the animals in such close proximity to the packing house. So we'll talk about all these things today.
So this is a slide showing the events that took place associated with the 2006 spinach outbreak. And how many people remember that spinach outbreak? Yeah, if you were a lover of spinach, you could not find spinach on any grocery store shelf because what happened is that they couldn't trace back exactly who was causing the outbreak. They just knew it was coming from spinach. And essentially anyone selling spinach on the market, their product was pulled and they couldn't sell anything. And you know, that was really a good lesson to all the growers that, hey, it's not only what I'm doing, it's what everybody else is doing that is also selling in similar markets, because a lot of times we may not know if it's at farm A or farm B. We'll just know a commodity that's associated with, and it may drastically impact your sales. A few of you in here growing tomatoes, same thing happened in 2008, right? When we had a tomato pepper outbreak,
Jalapeno.
and they really couldn't figure out what was going on there either. And a lot of growers had tomatoes that sat in the field because buyers weren't willing to carry them anymore. In this operation, we've actually been able to go back and based upon the investigation that was done into that outbreak, essentially what happened is that you had adjacent land use where you had feral hogs getting in, wild boars getting in, and essentially you had fecal shedding by these feral swine in pasture with infected range cattle, so just pasture grazed cattle, in that adjacent land use. You also had that feral swine actually making their way into the spinach fields themselves, because since they're next door, they might as well come and get some spinach while they're at it. Essentially what happened is you had really low levels of contamination that came from that event with those feral swine getting into the field. Around 1 cell per 10 grams of spinach was estimated for the contaminated product to actually make its way in that field setting. So that's fairly low levels. For most healthy people, that would not be enough to make anyone sick. However, I like to say there's no such thing as an infectious dose. You actually, if you're very immunocompromised or young or elderly or pregnant, a lot of times very low levels actually can make you ill. So again, it's kind of like a numbers game, and are you unlucky or are you going to be on the lucky side of that equation? So you had those feral hogs coming into that spinach field and definitely contaminated with fecal material. So you may think, okay, how much are feral hogs really going to be able to wreak havoc? And I can tell you, especially in Tennessee, we've had reports of huge amounts of feral hog activity coming into fields. And how many was that one operation saying they had killed?
In 200 in a year.
Yeah. And so they tend to be in vast numbers, and they're all drinking from similar water sources. And so a lot of times if one of them is carrying a pathogen, like E. coli, then they're all going to be carrying that pathogen. So in this case, they're coming into the field. The way spinach is harvested, you're actually harvesting it with, you can kind of see here in the picture, with the harvester, you're going to have that fecal material as well as contaminated soil. Essentially, when you have a rain event or something like that, you get a lot of splash and cross-contamination from that feces coming into where it's actually going to make its way onto the crop itself. And essentially what they were calculating is that they had roughly, if you started out with 1 cell per 10 grams, they had roughly a 10-fold increase per day in that population. So it went from 1 cell to 10 cells, and then from 10 cells to 100 cells every day due to temperature abuse and optimal conditions out in the field was what they were estimating those populations were growing to. They also had mixing and cross-contamination of plant pieces from multiple fields. So you have commingling a lot of times in these fresh cut leafy green operations. And that happens definitely in the processing plants where they're commingling. This is going into bag spinach. So we all buy that for salads and things along those lines. And in that commingling, basically you have disbursement of those few contaminated pieces of spinach into a lot of lots of spinach. And by dispersing that, you actually allow for you to infect a lot more people. And that is why it was such a large outbreak. Essentially, there was also some temperature abuse that happened at the actual retail store itself. And again, as a grower, this is out of your control, but I would say the retail industry is hopefully learning their lessons and how to better control temperature. And essentially, within that temperature abuse, again, you had another opportunity for these organisms to grow, not like really quickly, but they can grow rather slowly during that shelf life of that product, which can be week, 10 days, and possibly a little bit longer once it makes its way from the processor to the retail setting. They estimated that they had anywhere from roughly 1 cell to 28 cells per 85 grams of spinach. And you may be thinking, okay, why 85 grams of spinach? Well, that's roughly what you would get in a serving if you were eating a salad or something along those lines. So they have fairly low numbers in this finished product, but they had over 4,000 people get sick from that outbreak. And that is an incredible number of people that they were estimating actually became ill from this. You notice this says estimated illnesses. We have a multiplication that we do anytime we have one reported illness. Typically it's somewhere around 20 to 30. For every one reported illness, you actually have 20 to 30 more people that did come down with something. But inevitably, how many people in here ever think that they've gotten sick from something they've eaten? Yeah. And for those of us in the room who think that, how many of you actually got sick enough that you went to the doctor? Yeah, and so that's what happens a lot of times, right? You ride it out, you get the stomach flu, and many times that's what we see with foodborne illness. And it's really more so the young, the pregnant, the old, the immunocompromised that have worse health outcomes and do need some hospitalization and further treatment and support. So inevitably, this definitely rocked the leafy green community. They started to change practices drastically out west where they were growing a lot of this product, and they had Leafy Green's marketing agreement come into place and strengthened as part of this as far as requirements go for food safety practices. So it really truly shows how something just as simple as some feral hogs getting into your field can ultimately result in something like this. We've seen other instances where things like deer, and growers all the time are like, what am I supposed to do about some deer, right? But we've had an outbreak probably 2008 and with strawberries associated with deer getting into the field. And that outbreak made, I think it was around 50 people ill. And that grower was selling just through roadside stands and through local markets. So they were not by any means a large distributor, but they simply had enough contamination taking place in the field. Because again, you're not just going to have one deer. You're going to have, multiple deer coming into that field and contaminating.
And Faith mentioned that this spinach outbreak, they took all the spinach off the shelves, but it even went beyond spinach. So even bagged lettuce salads, if you look at the statistics, the sales tanked on everything that was a leafy green during that time. And it took a good 6 months for the market to recover in this area. So it had really far-reaching effects, even beyond spinach. So you might think, oh, I don't grow spinach, I don't have to worry about that. But any leafy green, the sales just plummeted after this outbreak, and people didn't want to touch it for a while.
Yeah, it's crazy. Some things are staples, and people are a little bit more forgiving of them. Raw hamburgers, an example. Peanut butter is a pretty good example. But things like spinach, people are like, oh no, that spinach is dangerous. I'm steering clear of it. And it took them a really long time to even start to regain their market. And inevitably, even like 4 years down the road, the spinach people are still saying their market wasn't back where it was prior to that. So it was a long-lasting effect.
Yeah. So animals are a concern because they carry these human pathogens, and this is Faith's area of delight and expertise. But they carry things like E. coli and Salmonella and Listeria, and we'll talk about all this in more detail on the next slide. But they can spread these human pathogens, of course, by depositing feces in the field or by spreading that fecal contamination as they move through the field. And they're very difficult to control. We know this. We are out in an agricultural setting, except if we're growing year-round tomatoes, which need to be in a greenhouse.
Well, he didn't say that. They're inside. All ours are inside their hot ponds.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's a little.
Shitty water.
Yep, that's
Right,
a little
so you have the
different
best of all
scenario.
worlds.
Yeah, you do have the best of all worlds. So in an outside situation, you're not going to control birds from flying over your field. And I was in a field in the northern neck of Virginia, probably nearly 10 years ago now, and it was a 20-acre spinach field that they were growing for Dole. And the Dole executives came to visit the field. They saw goose tracks in the field, and they said, we don't want your spinach. 20 acres worth. They didn't want to touch it because they saw goose tracks. Now, anybody that has geese near their farm know that they are not easy to control. And for something like that, it just knocked out 20 acres of spinach. So even if you're using fencing, the best fences can easily be breached by these animals. They're very smart. We had a corn trial in Crossville several years ago. We had electric fence all around the field. We had our lay flat drip tape going in over that electric fence, and the raccoons were smart enough that they climbed in on that lay flat drip tape to avoid the electric fence. They got right in to our cornfield and ate away our sweet corn just by climbing on that lay flat instead of onto the electric fence. So complete exclusion is not possible, but there are things you can do to try to reduce those populations and risk to your field.
So on the screen, it's a little hard to see, but in your handout, you can see really what we're trying to give you a feel for. What are some of the outbreaks we've seen associated
and
with,
all the fun symptoms you get if you
right,
get these
yeah,
things.
and all the good stuff. What are some of the outbreaks we've seen associated? And the first table here is just bacteria. And the thing to know about bacteria is there are 3 common groups that we lump foodborne pathogens into. Bacteria, they're different in the fact that they can actually grow. They don't need a host, so they can grow just in the environment. Some of the examples we have up here are Campylobacter, Shiga toxin-producing E. coli. A lot of people talk about E. coli, and in reality, E. coli is not that simple. E. coli is like a big family where you have the black sheep of the family, and then, maybe it's just a little different. And that would be what Shiga toxigenic E. coli is. And in essence, it is kind of the offshoot that can make people sick. And the reason it makes so many people, really a concern for so many people, is because of the outcomes that come along with it. If you ever are in jeopardy and they say, what are the symptoms associated with a certain foodborne pathogen, you can almost always guess vomiting and diarrhea, and you'll notice that in your table. But you'll notice when it comes to Shiga toxin-producing E. coli, it causes hemolytic uremic syndrome, which actually affects kidney function, and it most commonly impacts very young children. So 5 and younger most commonly come down with this, where they actually have to be put on dialysis for supportive care. On the other end of the spectrum, for the elderly, a lot of times it'll cause thrombotic thrombocytopenia purpurea, or what I like to say is TTP. And the result of that is it actually causes strokes in the elderly. So 2 very awful outcomes that can have long-lasting impacts is one reason why we talk so much about Shiga toxigenic E. coli, and a lot of times you'll hear this referred to as E. coli 0157. It's an organism we'll speak to. Within it, 10 to 100 cells can make people ill, but like I said, you can't have lower than that if you're a really immunocompromised population.
And if you think about how big bacteria is.
Right, I mean, you can fit 1 million on the tip of a pin, so it's not like you're going to be able to see these things.
And you're not ever going to start out with 1 cell generally. You're already going to have more there. So
the animals that can carry this, we put animals in here since that's our focus of today. Healthy domestic ruminants, such as cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, deer, wild birds, flies, and slugs. So just about anything can carry this organism. The outbreaks we've seen have been a lot of leafy greens, so spinach and lettuce, sprouts, and unpasteurized apple juice, where they're actually using drops many times, and deer were getting into those fields. With the Campylobacter, it typically is not as commonly associated with produce. I would say that, again, you have vomiting and diarrhea associated with it. The kind of worst case scenario for it, or longer lasting health impacts, is Guillain-Barré syndrome. And Guillain-Barré is a scenario where essentially your immune system kind of revolts, and it actually impacts your motor function, and you can't control, many times it's your extremities, so you can't use your legs or your arms as you would normally. And this will rear its ugly head months after you've recovered, and it's highly associated with having Campylobacter infections. I'll say that our typical animal hosts are poultry, but we also see it in cattle and pigs. We also see some dogs carrying it, as well as wild birds. peas have been the only produce-related outbreak we've seen with it. But again, if you have cattle or definitely poultry within close proximity to where you're growing produce, it would be a concern. We have a higher infectious dose, so you think, well, fewer people probably get sick with this organism than others, but in reality, a lot more people get sick with Campylobacter than any other bacterial foodborne pathogen. The next one we'll talk about is Listeria monocytogenes. It has typically a fairly low infectious dose, somewhere between like 100 to 900 cells. In essence, Listeria acts a little bit differently in that it actually causes septicemia in people who come down with it. And due to the fact that it can cause a infection in your entire body, many times it's going to result in meningitis and stillbirth if you're pregnant. It actually causes spontaneous abortions in the 3rd trimester. So that's why if you've ever been pregnant or known somebody who is pregnant, a lot of times they talk about steering away from deli meat and soft cheeses, and that's because of a risk of Listeria being there. What we see with Listeria is that it's commonly found in soil and water, but there are animals that essentially can pick it up from drinking or eating grass and drinking from surface water. And we can see any domestic or wildlife carrying this organism as well. The outbreaks we've seen, we've had a really big cantaloupe outbreak recently in the past 5 years associated with Listeria. And we've also seen cabbage was one of the first outbreaks actually where Listeria was associated with it. A lot of times we'll have a higher risk for crops which are held cold for long periods of time, so that's why we had an issue with cabbage. It's also a risk with apples because, again, they're held for a long period of time. The cantaloupe was actually just filth within the packing house and using equipment that wasn't well cleaned between. Salmonella is essentially vomiting and diarrhea for the most part. It can also cause septicemia in worst case scenarios. We have anywhere from 1 to 100,000 cells being associated with illness. And as far as who carries this, well, any animal ultimately can carry this. It's going to be warm in both cold-blooded animals, so you're going to see reptiles start to come into the mix here. And in essence, they're going to be healthy, so they're not actually going to be actively showing signs of any sort of illness. There have been a lot of different produce-related outbreaks. So we've had almonds, arugula, basil, cantaloupe, cilantro, lettuce, mangoes, orange juice, papaya, hot peppers, sprouts, and tomatoes, all associated with salmonella. Tomatoes, we have a lot of people growing tomatoes, and salmonella tends to be one of those things that we see more commonly associated with tomato outbreaks. Yersinia is the last one. I would say that we see very much lower number of cases of Yersinia. Essentially, you're going to have acute abdominal pain and fever associated with yersiniosis, which is the disease it causes. It has a very high infectious dose. And you primarily see healthy domestic livestock, mainly pigs, wild rodents, and freshwater fish carrying Yersinia. We've seen this in both carrots and lettuce as far as outbreaks go. And again, those are kind of, you probably would never hear about those on the news, but just a few things associated with that. So these are all the bacteria and kind of an overview. So when you're talking to, if you do want to develop a good agricultural practices program and get audited, many times you're trying to go through and speak to auditors about what are risks, and they like to know that you kind of know about these certain factors that you're trying to control for. The thing about bacteria, again, is that they can actually grow in crops and in the environment, so they can actually increase in numbers without having a host like us to replicate in. Parasites are different in the fact that they actually have to have a living host to grow in, and they basically hijack our metabolic systems and use some of our cellular systems to actually enable them to grow. In parasites, the one parasite that we would focus on for produce is Cryptosporidium that's associated with livestock and wildlife. And essentially with Cryptosporidium, you're going to see vomiting and diarrhea. We have, instead of cells, with crypto, they're actually called oocysts, and in essence, think of that as like an egg, basically. So that's similar to the number of organisms you have, and anywhere from 10 to 100 can make people sick. There are many domestic and wild animals, basically, that can carry crypto commonly, and you also can see them in very young animals. A lot of times they're going to have a higher prevalence of parasites. Again, similar reasons that their immune systems aren't able to fight them off as well as older animals. We've seen crypto pop up with unpasteurized apple cider. Again, just risk of a lot of people use drops in cider production, so just having that cross-contamination there. And here's what they look like up close. Lovely. But again, the thing with parasites are they're not going to be able to grow. They're going to survive in the feces, so they're going to just be sitting there, but they're not actually going to be able to increase in numbers due to anything that we see that we're going to do. So after they're sitting there, they may die off slightly, but they're probably just going to hang out at very low levels. The third bucket, which we don't have shown up here, are viruses. And we don't actually have viruses being expelled commonly by wildlife, so we didn't include those. But we do have other things like norovirus that fall into this category, which really we're the primary cause of contamination for. So there are some other things we didn't include here. We've really tried to limit this to what you can see in wildlife and domestic animals.
And now that Faith has ensured that nobody eats the salad at lunch besides her, we're going to talk a little bit about management options and things. So we know that wildlife can be a valuable part of your farm in the natural landscape. And depending on the species, your management options may be limited by the county, state, or federal laws. So you always want to be aware of that. And these populations may be resident or they may be transient. They might just be passing through like migratory birds or something like that. And wildlife with close associations to human activities can pose greater risks. So things like seagulls feeding at dumps or starlings feeding in a cattle feedlot. So just things you want to think about again. You want to think about what's going on your entire farm and where you can reduce those risks as much as possible from wildlife.
So things you want to ask yourself is, do you commonly find wildlife feces in your produce fields? And, you know, honestly, a lot of people probably aren't looking that hard, right? You may come across it when you're harvesting every now and again, but most people don't go out actively scouting for it unless they are trying to pass a GALP audit, and then they have to start looking for signs of animal intrusion. So just starting to build that base of knowledge a lot of times is really important. So how often do you find signs of activity as far as feces goes? Is it widely distributed? Does it commonly only occur in one field or even in one section of one field? Is it in contact with produce? You know, what type of crops are you growing, or is it going to be something that touches the ground or higher up off the ground? Is your farm in an area that large numbers of animals visit? So are migratory bird patterns during certain times of year? Do you have deer coming through? Wild pigs, things along those lines, where you're going to have a lot of animals coming into that field at one time. And ultimately, what management practices, we hope you'll be able to answer this when you leave today, can you actually implement to limit wildlife contamination of produce fields and water sources?
And we hope nobody has an alligator in their field in Tennessee, or we're in big trouble.
Yeah.
Oh, I skipped a slide there. So one thing we talk about is co-management, and that's striking a balance between environmental concerns and food safety concerns. So we want you to keep natural resources in mind. The Natural Resources Conservation Service, or the NRCS, also wants you to keep that in mind. And with the first iterations of FSMA, there were some things that they went back and changed for that reason, because NRCS has done a great job of building up practices in our state and across the country for many years. So we want to think about the stewardship and the aesthetic and the business objectives that you have, but also have food safety in the back of your mind at the same time.
So some conservation practices support wildlife and may increase wildlife activity near produce fields. I know a lot of people, when they first started going into getting GAP audited, they would go in and rip out buffer zones and things along those lines because their GAP auditors told them to. In reality, they are taking away vegetation the wildlife may have stayed in, and they start coming into their field. Yep. So again, there have been a lot of practices that have changed without a lot of thought as far as co-management goes. So some farms have stopped or changed their conservation practices, again, primarily around those practices which were perceived to provide a habitat for wildlife. So vegetation, and as far as especially vegetation very close to your plots, and what water sources you're pulling from. So if you maybe were pulling from a surface water source previously, where you can't control what your neighbor upstream's doing from you, maybe you were able to go to a well or something along those lines. The thing to remember, though, is that ultimately removing conservation practices can damage some of these natural resources, especially around soil. A lot of times you go pulling up greenery, you're going to have a lot more likelihood of erosion. That erosion is going to definitely impact your waterways as well as the overall land in itself. Water and wildlife are all going to be impacted through these practices. And again, we had people pulling up a lot of these buffer zones where you did have shrubbery and you did find wildlife. And then the wildlife started coming into their fields because they were going to be there anyways. So they actually didn't do anything to mitigate risk, and they only made the problem worse in reality.
And oftentimes we have woods on the edge of our fields, and when we talk about food safety, I always say that when we're doing food safety practices, it's often not just for food safety, but also production considerations. And woods is one example of that. There's good evidence that if you have a field that's near the woods, you might have heard of the insect pest, the brown marmorated stink bug. Has anybody heard of that? It's kind of marching across Tennessee. It started on the East Coast in the 90s, actually, and the populations are building, and it's a really tricky insect to control. And there's been studies that the closer you are to the woods, the higher the population in those rows of the brown marmorated stink bug. So it's when you're laying out your field, think about what's close to it and what might be in there. So besides that brown marmorated stink bug, which its host is many different trees as well as a lot of our fruits and vegetables. So if you're near a woods, that's why you have a higher population of those, but you also might have a higher population of deer that's right there on that edge of the field. So a lot of those considerations you want to be thinking about when you're plotting out where you're going to put things on your farm. And if you do know you have a heavy deer population, then that's when you might want to plant something that the deer's really attracted to, so they're not going to come into your vegetable field. They're going to stay on the edge with something that you've intentionally planted there for them. So it's that trade-off and thinking about the natural resources and also what your populations are and what animals we're dealing with.
So ultimately, you're going to want to review the risk and benefits of practices as they relate to your farm and conservation of that farm. So again, having a bare ground buffer or a hedgerow vegetation, things along those lines as far as what you may want to do to mitigate risk. Consider impact on conservation always. It's not just single-sided, right? You're trying to do everything that's good, not only for food safety, but also for management of the land in reality. So think about unintended consequences, direct conflicts between produce safety and conservation. Again, a lot of people are destroying a lot of buffer zones and pulling everything out of all the land, when in reality it maybe didn't need to be done. They could just minorly altered some of their practices.
So some of the potential negative effects of changes in management due to food safety concerns are, as Faith already mentioned, impacts on water quality for aquatic organisms and habitat, for wildlife, as well as removing those riparian areas or wetlands to try to reduce food safety risk. Well, you're taking out the habitat for a whole lot of animals. And oftentimes these can be endangered animals as well. So we want to think about those impacts on the non-target species, and that could be things like bioaccumulation up the food chain to raptors and bobcats and other predators due to using rodenticides on your farm. So we want to be aware of all these things in bait stations. So if you're using those poisons in the bait stations and then you have animals coming and eating those, that all goes up the food chain. So we want to be aware of all that. Another thing that I found a lot when we were putting this together was people talking about putting copper sulfate into their water to kill all the frogs out of the water. And that is just terrible, not only for the frogs that are in that water that you're trying to get rid of, but that has effects on earthworms and on the soil, and that heavy metal.
Yeah, copper's not going to just.
Yeah, it's just, there's a lot more negatives than positives in that practice. So you want to be aware of all that.
So, again, potential negative effects of changes in management when people are just thinking about food safety are compromised in water quality due to reduced use of treatment systems such as vegetated ponds and grass waterways. Inevitably, when you have water runoff coming into a stream, having that nice grass buffer zone is going to always help remove some of those organisms that may also be washing into that waterway with the feces. And so it's going to actually keep them on the land versus actually going into the water. And you also are going to see increased sedimentation in waterways due to soil runoff, leading to reduced aquatic habitat and less capacity to handle flood waters due to removal of vegetation and basins that catch sediment before it enters the waterway. So thinking about, again, your soil health and keeping it from eroding is always important.
Question.
Mm-hmm.
On the waterways, of course, y'all are, you're not really saying anything about city water because there's supposedly not no hazard there. But if you're using spring water, well water, pond water, river, out of a river, whatever, how often does that have to be tested?
Will you repeat the question?
So he was talking about waterways, and if you're not using a city water source, which you should know the quality of through your municipality, how often do other water sources like wells and springs and rivers and creeks need to be tested? So it's going to vary depending on the water source, and that is a whole nother workshop we're doing. But the short answer is, if you're using a surface water source, so a pond that's on your farm or a river or a creek, you're going to need to do 20 samples of that over a 2 to 4 year period to get what they call a baseline, so you know the general quality of that water, at least during that snapshot in time that you took those 20 samples. If you're using something like a well, then you need to have 4 samples for your baseline. Even a spring is considered surface source, so that would be a 20 sample one, because it is exposed to the surface, so it's not capped off like a well is. So a well is a lot less stringent, actually. But the well, you do 4 samples as your baseline, and then you have to do 1 a year. With the surface water sources, once you get up to that 20 over that 2 to 4 year period, you have to do 5 every year during your production period.
Well, I just know y'all were talking.
So a lot.
I know about it, pretty much.
Yeah.
I know y'all were talking about, the water sources and the feces and getting in it and
Yep.
whatnot. And I thought that was a good question to be asking about.
Yep. And that's exactly why they want the testing more frequently. But if you think about it, I can go and test my river that I'm pulling water out of right now, and your 100 head of cattle might come through 5 minutes after I do that test. So I might not have been contaminated 5 minutes ago when I took the test, but now I am, and I'm applying that to my water. And I don't get those results for a few days. So there's some things to think about there as well, and how useful that is. But you're using the safest source of water by using municipal water that you can, but it can be very expensive.
We grow stuff outside also.
Yeah.
And, of course, there ain't no way you can do irrigation out of city water.
Right.
And not go broke, pretty much. Yeah. So as we go from East Tennessee to West Tennessee, we see a lot more people using wells. In East Tennessee, we see a lot more surface water sources. And then as you move west, more people are using wells. And so we see the gamut across the state of water sources, and we've done studies on that water quality, so we've seen the differences there as well. Yep.
So whenever you're thinking about co-management practices, the most important thing is they actually be science-based. A lot of times people just have a knee-jerk reaction because they want to do something, right, to check a box. And in reality, they may be doing way more harm than they ever were doing good, and they may not be able to get back to where they were at before they took the action. They also want you want to ultimately be adaptable, because you're not just going to be going in and growing the same crop in the same field most likely year after year after year. You're going to be rotating things around. And therefore, maybe what you do this year, you're not going to do the next year. And you may also have different risks that are imposed. I mean, if you start to see a lot of development happening, you may start to see a concentration of wildlife increase that you hadn't expected or ever seen before. So making sure that you're having a plan that you're going to be assessing and changing over time. Again, it needs to be collaborative, not only with food safety in mind, but also co-management. And as far as conservation goes, and commodity specific, again, think about, okay, what are the risks associated with a crop that's definitely going to get cooked versus like sweet potatoes that are grown in the ground versus a risk associated with something like a strawberry. And try and say, okay, this maybe, if I do have a lot of animal activity, I'm going to go to one of those crops that's less vulnerable. And again, site-specific, as Annette was talking about, where you do start to notice patterns as far as animal activity go, having different practices there, or trying to basically hedge your bets for keeping the wildlife out of your plots as much as possible.
And every farm, just like anything else, every farm is different. So what your neighbor's doing might not work for you. So that's where we're talking about site-specific as well, that you really want to be aware of what your issues are on your farm and what things might work for you. And when we're talking about collaborative for the co-management piece, you want to think about, okay, I've talked to my NRCS representative and this is what they recommend for my farm, but then you also want to have that conversation before you might implement it with someone with the food safety expertise, so they can say, well, from a food safety perspective, this is what we don't like about this practice. Or, have that conversation on the front end before you say, oh, we took this money from the NRCS to do X, Y, or Z on our farm, and so now we have to do it. And then you're going for an audit, and the food safety inspector comes out and goes, wait a minute, I can't approve you with this here. And so you want to have those conversations at the start, and so everybody's on the same page. And remember that your gap auditor is a human, so if they say, nope, you have to rip this out, have it well thought out that you can say, we did this for this reason, and this reason, and have that conversation back and forth. Don't just necessarily take it on blind faith, because they might know about the food safety piece, but they might not know about the co-management side and what you're doing for the natural resources. So it's a back and forth conversation, and don't just be willing to say, okay, my auditor told me I have to do this, I'm going to do it. I'm not going to put copper sulfate in my water sources because somebody told me to, because it has a whole lot of negative effects. And if you go through those with somebody and they realize what's going on, that's a different conversation than if you just say, okay, I'll do it, and you're doing things and not knowing why. So what you'll also find is you won't find a lot of examples of co-management, and that's because of those reasons on the last slide. They're going to be very commodity specific. They're going to be site specific. So nobody's going to say, this is a practice we want you to do on every farm, because again, every farm is different. So one example, I just gave you a few things so you can get some examples of what co-management strategies are. One is well-maintained cover crop between your rows. If you have a wild cover crop coming up through your rows, that's a good place for lots of rodents and other small animals to hide, right? But if it's well-maintained and it's mowed, you're going to have less of that effect. And if it's a mowed crop and you do have some rodents, it's a farm, you're going to have rodents. The birds can see them from way up and come down and help you control them. So this is something we do on our farm in Knoxville. We planted teff grass between our rows, and it worked very well for us. We'd go through and mow it so it would keep it nice and shallow, but it also makes it so we can walk through that field if it had rained, and we're not going to get 4 inches of clay on the bottom of our boots, which we normally do at our farm. And so it makes it easier for us to go in and harvest. It also keeps that soil from splashing up into our crop, which is again a food safety consideration, because those pathogens that Faith mentioned that can be present in the soil, if we're getting a lot of rain splash, it's going to splash up and into our crop. So for us, this has worked well, and it also prevents any erosion from in between our rows in the field. Another one is judicious use of buffer strips. So buffer strips can be very helpful for building up healthy populations of beneficial insects that'll help you with insect control or pollinators, and you want to think about where you're placing those buffer strips and what else might be using them besides what you want to be using them. And then you want to know the species that you're planting. So for an example, some grasses produce less seeds than others. So a lot of the wildlife likes to eat that seed. So if you know your species, even among the same grass, if there's a variety that's a lower seed producer than another, you want to be thinking about all that stuff when you're going to plant there. So you always want to check with your auditor if you're not sure about a practice before you're implementing it, instead of after.
So
Oh, we have a question over there.
What did you call it? Teff grass?
Teff grass, yes.
How's it spelled?
Teff. It's an African grass, and we actually did some trials with ryegrass and teff. Ryegrass is a lot cheaper, but the teff established much better and held up to our traffic over time. So we liked it. We'll probably do it again next year. This was the first year we used it, but it did very well.
And is it a summer annual grass?
It is a summer annual, yes. Yep. So, yeah, it stands up to the heat very well.
and that was talking about splash. They've been doing studies at the University of Georgia looking at splash height when you have a rain event. And they've actually gotten splash as high as 5 feet. So a lot of people think, well, splash, I'm not growing a vine crop down on the ground. I don't need to worry about that. But inevitably, they've pretty much proven that you can get transfer. And they were also looking for pathogens in that splash. You can get that soil transferring those organisms very high up. So having something like a grass where you're not having as much soil is definitely going to be beneficial.
And along those same lines, a lot of folks do either landscape fabric for their row so they don't have to do weeding in the row, or they use a black plastic on the row, and then they might do straw in between so they have less maintenance there. Well, with straw, you want to be careful about what you're harboring in that straw, because that's a great place for the rodents to hide. It's also a great place for a lot of species of insects to get in there under there. Like the stink bugs can overwinter there, and the squash bugs overwinter in that straw between your rows. So you want to be thinking about all that stuff, because again, it's like a 2-for-1 there, the production aspects and the food safety side.